Hey, Carol, we just came from headquarters and we need a good story.
A good story, really? I got one. So, years ago, I had a supervisor, and he wanted to teach me how to make lists. I hate lists. So, he'd pull out his stenography notebook, and I happen to have one right here, and he'd say, "Now, Carol, Ranger Carol, when I have something to do, I write it down. Now, when I complete that assignment, I cross it out." And then he would say, "Ranger Carol, this is how I want you to operate." And I'd be like, uh-oh. And I'd say, okay. So if I knew he was having a meeting with me, I'd go in his office the night before, nobody else would be in the building, and I would find his stenography notebook. I would erase things off his list. I would do that. And then the next day, we'd have a meeting, and he'd pull out his stenography notebook. He'd be going down, and all of a sudden, he'd get to a blank line. And remember, that blank line is because I had erased it off the night before. And he'd say, I wonder why that line is blank. And I would say, I don't know.
Carol? I'm sorry, am I interrupting something?
Hey, how you doing?
I'm good. I wanted to tell you about this great list I have here.
A list?
Yeah, it's a list of the history of the park in 10 items.
A list?
Yeah, it's a list. And things like this great Civil War handguard that
Let
we
me see that.
You don't touch that with your bare hands, Carol. You need to have gloves on. Yeah, this is 150 years old.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, here's some gloves for you. Special Ranger Carol gloves.
Special. Let me see. All right. I guess. All right, I can handle it.
Yeah, be careful with that. That's a piece of our history.
All right, and it has to do with the list.
It has to do with the list. 10 things, a history of the park in 10 items.
All right, so green gloves. I think I can handle this list, which simply means it's going to be another incredible, cool, exciting segment of Wild Outdoor Adventures with Ranger Carol and the crew. So when I talk about Cumberland Gap's history, I always think of it as a textbook, chapter after chapter, so rich in information. But today, we're going to talk about Cumberland Gap's history with a list, those lists that I love. And we're going to look at 10 items that really walk us through. Well, that first chapter in Cumberland Gap's history is really who came through the gap, or whom came through the gap. And to really tell us that story with an item from the list is Marcus Jones, an intern with the American Conservation Experience. Listen up, Marcus is filled with a wealth of information.
All right, guys, what I have here in front of me is a skull from a woodland bison. Now, the woodland bison is a very important chapter in Cumberland Gap's history here. A lot of folks think of the 310,000 pioneers that came through, but in fact, the first visitor through the Cumberland Gap was the woodland bison. That trail that those 310,000 follows was carved out by this very animal. Now, the woodland bison were an interesting creature. If you come to the park today and you drive up Interstate 58, you'll see two herds of buffalo. Now, those buffalo were brought off the plains. The woodland bison that I have here in front of me was a much smaller animal, about half the size of those bison. They lived in a forest that they said it would take 5 grown men to wrap around one tree. So you can imagine such an animal coming through that forest couldn't have been quite as big as the buffalo you'll see here today, but very important in the story of Cumberland Gap. Now, they would carve the path. They would move through the gap for several ages before the Native Americans would pick up on their trail. Now, the Native Americans used the buffalo for many different connotations. It was their food source. It was a tool. It was a lot of different things for them. But in order to talk about the Native Americans, we'll need to pass it off to an expert.
Thank you, Marcus. I'm Park Ranger Jared Dotson with Cumberland Gap National Historical Park. And as Marcus was talking about the eastern woodland bison, one of the largest framed animals that we had in this area, a little later in history, you have humans using the area. We had two different tribes of Native Americans. One to the north was the Shawnee, one to the south were the Cherokee. This was their sacred hunting land. It was also referred to as Warrior's Path. Things that they would use to trek through this area would be this, like an arrowhead. This is made of chert. Very interesting tool that could be used for many different things. Not only hunting the bison that Marcus was talking about, but also defending the area that they felt to be sacred. So to make one of these arrowheads was a process. Again, this is made of chert, which is very much like flint, which most people are familiar with. They would actually use the ends of antlers, mainly deer, and they would sit and nap, knocking off tiny pieces of this rock to sharpen it down to a razor sharp edge. These were very uncommonly used twice. Generally, when it was shot, they would break. Very fragile, but very effective. A second group of people would be making their way through the Cumberland Gap not too long after this era. They would be bringing with them more modern tools, pots, pans, knives made of metal, just like this kettle. This is an amazing piece of history, but I'm not the person you should talk to about this. I think I'm going to hand it off to someone else.
Wow, thanks, Jared. This is really cool. I'm Ranger Pam here at Cumberland Gap National Park. Sometimes they call me Pioneer Pam though, because I spend a lot of time studying about the people that we call pioneers that moved through the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky. They really thought of Kentucky as a promised land, had everything that they'd ever dreamed of. Fertile land to farm, animals to hunt, and an opportunity for them to achieve the American dream. But when they started deciding to move through, this was a great challenge to come through this mountain, through the gap. And they knew that this was just a small pathway, not much more than what the Native Americans had traveled. That meant that you weren't bringing a wagon over this mountain for many years. Also meant that you were going to have to carry everything either on your back or the back of a pack horse. When you look at this kettle that I'm holding, how much would something like that weigh? Maybe even up to 10 pounds. And when you start adding weights of the different items that they would need, you realize that as they added these things together, the weight added up very quickly. Even a pack horse can only carry about 200 pounds himself. So this would be a very special item, one of the few items that they would have chosen to bring. And although it's in awful shape at this point, it would have meant life to them, an opportunity and a way for them to cook for their families. As the hundreds of thousands of pioneers moved through, things started to change here at the Gap, and we even saw the first industry, and it had to do with iron. That was 1819. That was the iron furnace. But I'm not the one to talk to about the iron furnace. In fact, this pig iron is from that place. But let's turn this over to an expert. Hey, Marcus, can you tell them about this pig iron?
Thanks, Pioneer Pam. Oh, this is a pretty cool piece of history here. This is a remnant of the pig iron that you would have found down by the iron furnace. Now, originally these bars would be in length that would equal about 150 pounds. Of course, that's not where we're at today with this piece that's in my hand. But when we talk about the iron furnace, that's a neat piece of Cumberland Gap's history that's not often mentioned. Built in 1819, the newly iron furnace ushered in a new age past the pioneer era. You no longer have pioneers coming through. You have folks that are actually settling down near what would become the town of Cumberland Gap and beginning to bring in some industry. The newly iron furnace was a really important piece of modernity for that town. It would usher in a new industrial age. It would be powered by water that would come out of Gap Creek, which flows out of Gap Cave, of course. The iron furnace would be fueled with timber to make the pig iron. You'd have the iron ore that came out of the cave mixed in with limestone, heated up in that furnace. When we talk about heating up in the furnace, a lot of people think that the park was originally logged. Well, it was, but not in the early 20th century, much like some of the forest in the region. It was logged in the early 1800s for the iron furnace. So as a result, by the time the Civil War starts to come around, there's not many trees left in the area. So it's a very good defensive point for either army that's going to come in. So with this pig iron, it was originally shipped down to the south to places like Chattanooga to be used for goods for blacksmiths to make into various home goods. But as the Civil War starts to come around, the home goods will be turned into military goods, and an invasion will come to the Cumberland Gap. Now, when we talk about the Cumberland Gap in the Civil War, we're going to have to hand it off to an expert. I'm not the guy you want for that.
Thanks, Marcus. Ranger Jared here again. This artifact that I have in my hand touches home with me. The American Civil War is probably one of the most important times in American history because it defined us as a country. This artifact that I have in my hand represents much more than just a piece of metal. It represents the blood, sweat, and tears of 750,000 lives that were taken in less than 5 years of combat on this continent. The American Civil War shook the ground as it swept across America and touched every single family it ever came across. Both Union and Confederate soldiers fought it out for a very long time. 4 major armies during the Civil War: the Army of Potomac, Army of Northern Virginia, Army of Tennessee, and Army of the Cumberland. The two we mainly saw here were parts of the Army of the Tennessee and Army of the Cumberland. Cumberland Gap, as it has been for years, has served as a bottleneck of transportation. Also something to consider. Not only do we have the boundaries of 3 states here, but at that time we had the boundary of 2 countries. Kentucky remained with the Union, Tennessee and Virginia both seceded. Both sides, both presidents, both President Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln, both had documents stating the name Cumberland Gap somewhere on their desk at the beginning of the war. It was something they both wanted, and they fought hard for it. Not so much on the battlefield, but with tactics and cutting off the other one's supply line. The artifact that I have is actually a piece of a sword. We're thinking it might be a part of a cavalry sword. It's actually the guard for your hand. If it is a cavalry sword, this would have been used more for fighting than anything else. There were many different types of swords during the Civil War. There were dress swords, parade swords. Dress swords were used a lot by officers to give commands to their men. If you have hundreds, even thousands of men behind you, it's very hard to yell and for all of them to hear you. So to give motions with the sword, you would be able, the men would be able to look at you and understand what you're talking about.
Hey, Ranger Carol here. So, it's up to you, it's up to me to safeguard our national parks. So when you visit, take a few moments, stop what you're doing, and see if that action might actually be harmful to the resources. Carving your name on a tree, carving your name on a cannon from the Civil War. Cool thing to do? I think not. Remember, stop, think. We're all here to safeguard these very, very special places, our national parks.
After the American Civil War, the country took a long spell to try to recover from a long time of despair. The area started to pick back up in the late 1860s when it comes to industrialism, and I actually have another artifact here that exemplifies that, but I am not the person to ask about this.
Wow. This is a piece that's near and dear to my heart. I'm Keith Bowling here with Cumberland Gap. This is a pickaxe found. I've actually seen this piece before, and it's near and dear to me because, well, my grandfather, he was a miner. My father was a miner, and until I was 18, I, of course, was a miner. But, here in Middlesboro, here in Cumberland Gap National Historical Park, there are all these rich resources, these different minerals. Like Marcus was saying, there's this iron oxide that many of them were searching for, creating this pig iron, maybe sent off later to be turned into other wonderful things, maybe even something like this. But, there's all these other things that they're still mining even today. We have rich amounts of limestone. This really awesome place that we're in, these Cumberland Mountains, they were formed by the Pine Mountain thrust sheet coming down, hitting that Powell Valley sheet and curving up steeply. So we've had all this area, to work with, this exposed area to mine for limestone, to make, gravels and help to pave our roads. And then, that kind of ushered in a whole wave of new industry. But also the one that still, I think everyone associates with the area, coal mining. Maybe even 150, 200 years ago when this piece was in its heyday, they were mining for coal. And that even goes on till today. And we've made huge jumps in that. We've went from, just this pointy piece of metal here to continuous miners and these augers, doing deep mining and even strip mining, changing the face of our landscape. But I think this piece is really neat. I've actually seen this one before. It actually was found during the discovered, during the blasting of the tunnels back in the 80s. So I think that's a really neat piece. And you know, we're still exploiting those resources today. And I think probably the thing that tells me the most is that all these resources, they were a draw. They were pulling in all these wonderful people, and they ushered in a new kind of pioneer, the pioneers of industry. People like, you know, Arthur, railroad men, and you know, even something like this might have been found around the time, these railroad tickets. But now I'm not the person you need to talk to about ushering in industry. That might be Miss Martha.
Thank you, Keith. These two items are some of my favorite things in our museum collection. Hi, I'm Martha Wiley. I'm the historian here at the park, and these two railroad tickets represent the age of progress, a time when all the efforts of the miners that Keith was telling you about began to be noticed by outsiders, to develop the rich resources of the area and to bring other people into the area to settle cities. One of these people was Alexander Arthur, a dreamer born in Canada of Scottish ancestry. He dreamed of making this area the Pittsburgh of the South. He came down here from the Smokies, from Newport, came on a trip through here in the 1880s and saw the lovely timber resources, the coal mining, and all the potential of the area. He decided to build a city here, Middlesboro. And to do that, he needed to have access to the outside world. He decided to build a railroad. And the railroad went through the tunnel, went to Knoxville, and eventually another line went to Louisville. So what it did is it really connected this area to the outside world, and Middlesboro became a melting pot of sorts. These railroad tickets, one of them is the Knoxville, Cumberland Gap, and Louisville Railroad. It took the passenger from the town of Cumberland Gap to Middlesboro, perhaps for the day, perhaps for to have a meal or to visit with family. This one is stamped 1893. This ticket is one of my favorites because I can imagine these people on the Knoxville, Cumberland Gap, and Louisville Railroad again going to the circus October 18th, 1894. It would have been a big day for everyone. But not everyone welcomed the progress to the area. Some people felt the need to retreat and go back to a more simple time. This washboard that we have in our collection typifies their story. But I'm really not the one to tell you about the Hensley and Gibbons families. For this, I'm going to hand you back over to Ranger Pam.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow, what a washboard. Hi, it's Pam again. When I hold this, I think of a time when things were changing in this area, but a lot was still the same. And especially when you think about the plight of women, because this was still a men's world. You know, up on top of the mountain, there was a settlement that was settled in 1903, and it actually was after Alexander Arthur had come in. And the people that settled there were the Hensleys and the Gibbons. And they had a foot in both worlds. And the foot that they had in the world of yesterday to them is actually typified through this item. The stories that we have that talk about the Hensleys and the Gibbons talk about old lifeways. And this washboard was part of those old lifeways. It was how they did their laundry. There was never any electric up there or running water. So I can imagine them on wash day, probably a Monday, pulling out all the tools of the trade, hauling their water, building their fire, and an exhausting full day of washing and rinsing and hanging out to dry. And as I look at this washboard, if I hold it up into the sunlight, I can actually see where the metal bends out, holes where it's been worn away by the woman with a soapy piece of clothing rubbing across that piece of metal and wearing it away. How must her hands have ached and hurt? But you know, a lot was going on down off the mountain. Maybe these women wanted to get away from Hensley settlement into the future, because down off the mountain, even main roads were being built here now in the Cumberland Gap. Hard surfaced roads like the Dixie Highway. The Dixie Highway, it really brought in a different type of visitor, tourists. But I'm not the one that you need to talk to about the Dixie Highway. That's Amy.
Wow, thanks Pam. This is another great article from our archives here at the park. Pam mentioned some of those early roads that come through Cumberland Gap. And here at the park, I'm a biologist and actually get to work in all those old roadbeds, which aren't really roadbeds anymore. They're really more reconstructed slopes, hillsides of the original trails that the pioneers took to come through the Cumberland Gap. One of those original roads that they actually created here at Cumberland Gap was the Object Lesson Road. That was completed in 1908, and it was actually done by the Department of Agriculture, but it was paid for by all the locals that lived here in Middlesboro, Harrogate, Cumberland Gap, and even Lee County, Virginia. You can actually come to our park today and walk the original Object Lesson Road trail that takes you right up to the historic Cumberland Gap saddle. Another cool road that came through the Cumberland Gap about 20 years later was the completion of the Dixie Highway. Now the Dixie Highway was stretched from northern states like Michigan, come right through the Cumberland Gap and connected the north to the south. That road really brought in a lot of traffic into our community and really started the first tourism for our tri-state area. Now along that road, you had homes that were built, you had hotels that were built, gas stations were built, and I have kind of a cool connection to that. One of the hotels that was actually built along the Dixie Highway in Cumberland Gap was the Cumberland Mountain Hotel. And my grandmother actually used to work at that hotel. She was a waitress in the restaurant there. A little bit further up of the Dixie Highway was where the Pinnacle Road started off. And the Pinnacle Road opened in 1926. Starting in 1926, the Pinnacle Road was open. It was called Skyland Drive. And because of the Pinnacle Road, that's when Cumberland Gap really got its start as a national park. One of the other cool items that we have here is this. This is the park stamp. It was created when the Cumberland Gap became a national park. And you know what? I'm really not the best one to talk about this item. I'll leave it off to somebody else.
Hey, Ranger Carroll here once again. So in the 1920s, roads were being improved, automobiles were becoming affordable to everyone. World War I had ended, people were euphoric, they had leisure time, they began traveling around the country, discovering this nation's incredible beauty. They were coming down here to Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. They saw the beautiful mountains, they saw the forested hills, and people in this area realized that people were coming here. The people in this area realized the rich history of the area also. They put two and two together and they said this could become a national park. Already in 1922, a group of folks gathered together up at Cincinnati, Ohio, with the intent of proposing that this become a national park. That national park's name would be Lincoln National Park. That name did not materialize, but the pace was set. It was moving fast. Shortly after that meeting in Cincinnati, the Kiwanis Club in Middlesboro gathered together. They too said that this should be a national park. The Park Service joined in, agreed, and on June 11th, 1940, Congress authorized the legislation that this become a national park. Now again, when the idea was first proposed in the 1920s, everybody thought the name should be Lincoln National Park. Ideas were thrown out. Up at what is now the Pinnacle, people said that there should be a statue of General Grant and a General Lee facing each other. Other people said that the face of President Abraham Lincoln should be carved in the rock of the Pinnacle. Again, none of that happened, but it was decided that the name of the park should be Cumberland Gap National Historical Park. Again, this is the first doorway to the west. So land was purchased by people in this area and eventually then provided to the government. And as that land was purchased and the paperwork came in, this stamp, the Kentucky Parks Commission, was used to show that, hey, this would become the national park. That momentum was flowing. In 1943, the governor of Kentucky, the governor of Tennessee, the governor of Virginia gathered up at the Tri-State Peak. They said that together we will ensure that this park does happen. And then the grand day, July 4th, 1959, Vice President Nixon was here for the dedication of this very special place. It was a scene that Middlesboro had never seen before. Parades, people from throughout the U.S. were here. It was a gala event. Yeah, this is a national park. This is your national park. This year we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the enabling legislation creating this very special place. And now next year, 2016, the National Park Service will celebrate its 100th birthday. Over 400 national park sites now comprise the national park system. And as we look at each one of these national parks, we could do like we did today with Cumberland Gap National Historical Park. We could make a list, yes, that list of 10 items. Every single national park can make a list of items that really represent the rich history, why that place is so special in America's history, in our hearts. Make your list for Cumberland Gap National Historical Park.